Hello and welcome to my video essay on Michelangelo Antonioni's landmark 1960 film L'Avventura, or in English The Adventure, which as you will see in this essay I interpret as an ironic title, though others might disagree. I want to start by mentioning that I wrote about Antonio once before in my book Becoming Jack Nicholson, where I analyzed the passenger through the lens of masculinity, and I'm going to draw from some of the things I talked about in that chapter in this essay. In all of his films, Antonioni continually defies audience expectations by depriving viewers of filmic conventions, such as pacing and music, to which they're accustomed. Jack Nicholson discusses the unique approach in an interview. He says, "The thing about this approach to filming is that it's exactly the opposite of the 25 years cycle of melodrama, wherein the audience of films is stimulated and I suppose you could say video games oriented, so this kind of pace is to me still fascinating." He goes on to comment, Antonioni is not melodramatic. He likes to observe in the simplest form. Let the time pass as it does, and you see things rather than hear them. Antonioni had been working on this style throughout the 1950s, but it wasn't till L'Avventura in 1960, his seventh feature film and his first international success, that he perfected this new cinematic language. So what do I mean by a new cinematic language? Well, up to that point in history, by and large, international cinema followed the film grammar and editing conventions that had been formalized in Hollywood by the 1920s. This included continuity editing, with eyeline matches, the 180-degree rule, the 30-degree rule, plot-driven montage, with the exception of Soviet montage, of course, parallel editing to build tension and suspense, non-diegetic scores that telegraph emotions or tell the audience how to feel about a scene, etc. Well, the French New Wave had already been playing around with breaking these conventions by 1960 through jump cuts and breaking the fourth wall. By and large, the cinema utilized these techniques. So here we see the film opening with whom we might assume will be our main character, Anna. In a moment, we'll watch her interact very distantly with her father. So as we said, Antonioni was trying to create a new cinematic language, and here in a moment we're going to see an early example of how he does this, and I'm going to talk about how to read an art film like Antonioni's. So in this shot here, you can see this older architecture in the background, this older building in the background, which Antonioni often features these kinds of distant objects within the frame that really he doesn't draw our attention to, but we notice them nonetheless, and that's how we really are supposed to read Antonioni's film, is through these objects in the background. So as the camera pans slightly to the left there, what you see is this newer architecture, this newer modern building here. And so early on, Antonioni is establishing this kind of theme that's going to run through the rest of the film, which is the old world versus the new world, or the past versus the present. And we can see it here again as he pans back over. We get another glimpse of that older building in the background. And I want to point out that most critics, or many critics, suggest that these aren't actually symbols in Antonioni's films, but metonyms. So when you think of a metonym in literature, you think of something like the crown standing in for the king, or the White House standing in for the president. And it's a similar concept in semiotics and in film, where you have these objects that stand in for something larger or something closely related to them. So a difference would be a symbol might be in something like Citizen Kane, the sled, which symbolizes Charlie Kane's lost innocence, his lost childhood, and the film draws attention to that symbol and really wants us to think about it and contemplate it. But that's different in Antonioni because these background objects are actually part of the world that the characters inhabit, and they actually represent the thing that they stand for here. So they actually are examples of the architecture, the old and new. There you actually see some nuns walking by, which is another interesting example of Antonioni's metonymic storytelling, because those nuns represent religion, something closely related, right? and they actually are part of the character's world, and they show us how religion is still here, it's still present, but increasingly we're going to see that these characters are sort of distant from Christianity. Christianity is not a big part of these characters' lives. And here you see a character named Claudia, and she is going to become a very important character in this film. She's Anna's friend, and she's a sort of witness to the life of the bourgeoisie here, which is the world that Anna belongs to, but Claudia does not. Claudia is Anna's friend, but she is of a lower socioeconomic status, and she is being sort of invited into into Anna's world here in an excursion where she is going to be a witness to the lives of the upper classes or the bourgeoisie.
Torniamo indietro, dai.
Anna, scendo subito.
So in this scene, we're going to be introduced to Anna's fiance, Sandro, who is an architect, but actually, we're going to find out later in the film, he doesn't actually design anything or build anything, which is what he really truly desires to do. But instead, he's a kind of consultant who gives estimates to clients who are richer than him, but he's become very wealthy doing this. And this scene is interesting because we're introduced to him in this apartment that has some really interesting architecture, and throughout the film he's going to be framed by architecture because that is associated with his character. And notice as Anna enters, she's going to be framed by this doorway that leads out into the open, and that's really important because she's already looking for an escape here from the confines of this apartment with Sandro. And look at him again being framed by this really interesting architecture, and her framed by the window with the wide open space behind her, because she is looking for a way out of this relationship. Again, this is how you read an Antonioni film. This is not in the dialogue, this is in the environment that the characters inhabit. And what you're going to see here is Claudia is waiting outside. Anna's friend is waiting outside, and we can see how insensitive Anna is, because here she's going to make love to Sandro, her fiance, while her friend waits for her outside. And as you watch, I want you to pay attention to how dispassionate this whole scene is. It's a love scene, but there's no love in it. It's very cold and austere. And again, you see the open window in the background, kind of reminding us that she needs to have that window open so she doesn't feel so confined here. And we cut there really quickly to Claudia to remind the audience she's out there waiting for her. And what I want to emphasize here is the lives of these characters are so empty, especially Anna and Sandro as well, as we're going to find out increasingly throughout the film. Their lives here in the modern world are so empty that they seek momentary relief or sort of a temporary escape from it with these empty sexual encounters, where this is not a love scene in any conventional way. This is a scene where I would almost say it's the opposite of a love scene, where these characters are making love, but there's no feeling behind it, sort of symbolizing the emptiness of the modern world and the impossibility of human connection in this world that has become sort of austere and cold. So here we have some interesting cross-cutting happening, because we're cutting between Sandro and Anna in the apartment, and here's Claudia wandering around as she's sort of waiting for them to come back out and so they can proceed on their day. And this functions differently from the kind of cross-cutting that we would get in classical Hollywood, where you would get this parallel editing to build tension, this happening, meanwhile this is happening over here, until the storylines converge. But the cross-cutting here, I think, subverts that in a way, because nothing is really happening in either storyline. Nothing in terms of the plot, but a lot is happening in terms of character here. So we are watching Claudia as she just sort of looks and witnesses. Remember, she's in that witness role throughout this film. And here we cut back and we get this interesting framing, very much like Antonioni's framing here, where characters are sort of cut off in the frame. And there's Claudia framed by the doorway, looking in, waiting. Again, not much happening in terms of advancing the plot, but we're sort of finding out about these characters. And then the scene ends and we get this quick, this dissolve, and then a shot of this car racing by as the encounter is over and
Deve
we're
essere
moving on.
Basiluzzo.
Basiluzzo. Sembra il nome di un pesce.
Quella invece è l'isca bianca.
Uffa, che noia! Quante storie per un bagno!
Anna! Ma... Attenti.
So I've jumped ahead a bit here in the film. So now our characters are on a cruise here. They're in the Mediterranean. They're on a pleasure trip on Corrado's yacht. Corrado is the bald character here that you see. He's a wealthy industrialist who's organized this trip, which is in the Aeolian Islands north of Sicily. And so you can see here we have a group of characters who are on this pleasure cruise together, and we haven't really been introduced to these characters formally. So this is one of the hallmarks of art cinema, where it may be difficult to see at first how characters relate to each other, who they are in relation to each other, what connections are between characters. We're just sort of thrust into their lives, and we have to kind of figure it out as we go. And so the characters on this cruise, that's Julia right there. She's married to Corrado, but you're going to see that increasingly throughout the film, their relationship is very distant. This is Patricia. She is she is without her husband on this trip, but Raimondo is flirting with her incessantly. He, much like we saw earlier with Sandro, and Anna is looking for a kind of sexual encounter with Patricia, who throughout this scene rejects him frequently. And we also have, of course, the three characters we've already been introduced to, which are Anna, Sandro, and Claudia. And the idea here is that they have decided to go on this cruise to do some swimming, some sunbathing, some sightseeing, a little bit of socialization, and they're going to be headed toward a sort of small uninhabited volcanic island, Lisca Bianca. This is not their main destination. It's just a sort of spontaneous stop to swim and explore. And we get this really interesting line here by Patricia about islands, where she says that they're surrounded by water. They're all alone, surrounded by water. And I think that line is important because it sort of establishes a connection between the islands and individuals, that the people in this film seem so disconnected from each other and from anything really larger than themselves, that they're all really kind of like these islands unto themselves.
Che meraviglia!
So again, I've cut ahead here a bit, and they're now on the island, and we're going to see a really important scene coming up here where Anna is going to try to have a conversation with Sandro. And remember, they are engaged to be married, but they haven't seen each other in quite a while. And she feels like maybe it's been so long that they're not really connected anymore. She doesn't really have feelings for him anymore. She's trying to tell him this, but he's really refusing to hear her, and he minimizes everything that she has to say. She says she's gotten used to being without him, and he says that that's normal. And she wants to talk about it, but she says, we won't be able to ever understand each other. And he, again, does not really take what she says seriously at all. And he's basically saying that if they talk about it, it will just lead to misunderstandings. And what I get from this really comes back to what I mentioned earlier about the islands, how everybody is an island unto themselves. And I feel like this is one of Antonioni's themes here, is the difficulty of communication between people, where they really cannot connect. They're supposed to get married, they're supposed to spend the rest of their lives together, but clearly Anna does not want to do that. She's yearning for freedom. She does not want to settle down with Sandro. She's not feeling connected with him, and she's pulling away from him. As you see, she physically pulls away from him here. And in the background, it's interesting that we get a glimpse of Julia, as we see throughout the scene. She's also very distant from her husband, Corrado, And I think Antonioni shows us throughout this film the difficulty of human relationships, how hard it is for people to connect, and how people really are like the islands that we're seeing in this throughout the scene, both in the foreground and in the background. They're literally on an island, but we're also going to be getting these glimpses of the islands in the background.
Tu devi sempre sporcare tutto.
So then in this same conversation, Anna says, the thought of losing you makes me want to die, yet I don't feel you anymore. So she's conflicted between what seems to be this desire to hold on to a feeling she had and a knowledge that it's already gone and she's not going to get it back, which speaks to me of the ephemeral nature of human connection, how we may feel infatuation, powerfully even for a time, but that feeling will fade and will ultimately still be alone afterwards.
Bisognerebbe andare via.
Perché mai?
Il mare sta ingrossando.
E Anna?
Ma non so. Mi pareva di sentire una barca.
So here we have a really crucial scene in the film. So Anna has disappeared now, and you might not catch it the first time you watch the film, but there's a subtle implication that maybe she found a boat or some fisherman was nearby and she's left on a boat, but we don't know that the first time we watch it, and the characters certainly don't know that, and she's missing. So they're very concerned about her safety, and they're going to try to find her before, of course, they have to leave the island. They can't leave without her. So we're going to get a lot of shots here coming up of characters really just searching for Anna among, you know, the environment here, which is, I think, very reflective of the inner states of mind or the inner landscape of these characters, because the environment is very desolate, it's very empty, it's very craggy, and to me it reminds me of how these characters are feeling in the modern world. They're feeling empty, just like this environment is empty. And we're going to be getting some scenes too here coming up of characters that from a very long shot, so they're off in the distance, and there's a lot of distance between characters as well, which to me also reflects not just the physical distance between them, but the emotional distance. Again, coming back to this idea of every person being an island and the difficulty of connecting with each other. I mean, look at this shot right here. He's very small and alone in the vast landscape. It's a sort of desolate landscape. And then we get this really interesting cutaway to the turbulent water, which I also think could be reflective of the character's emotional states, as it's very turbulent time here with Anna missing. And he comes into the frame, so the camera is not behaving the way the camera would in a classical Hollywood film. Watch this. He walks off the frame, out of the frame, but the camera stays on the environment rather than following him, and it slowly pans up, almost agonizingly slow, right? And then we see off in the distance here the other characters, Corrado, Claudia, Julia, are also still looking for Anna, but notice that the pacing still is extremely slow, and the characters don't seem very urgent here. And I think this is really fascinating because if you think back to what we just saw with the camera really lingering, first of all, the camera did not follow the characters. It cut to the environment, and then the character entered into the frame with the environment in the background, and then as the character left, the camera stayed on the environment. And to me, that speaks to a very anti-Hollywood kind of filmmaking, because the camera is not motivated by the character's actions. In classical Hollywood, the camera would follow the logic of classical Hollywood editing, where you have a character looking off into the distance, as we just saw there, and then we cut to an eyeline match. But in that scene we referenced earlier, we didn't have that kind of film grammar going on. We had a very unmotivated camera that was sort of lingering on the environment. So now you see Julia, she's also looking for Anna, as are all the other characters. And remember, she's married to Corrado, and their relationship is on the rocks, so to speak. And here we cut back to Claudia, still kind of not seeming very frantic in her search, and the camera still tracking with her in a very languid sort of pace. And then we get this wonderful frame right here, which is very Antonioni. And actually, what you saw there is a volcano in the background. And I think that it's important to note that the volcano will be closely linked to Claudia throughout the film. We're going to see in a lot of shots that there are volcanoes lingering in the background of the frame when Claudia is in the shot. There we see Julia and Corrado very, very far apart from each other, the physical distance mirroring the emotional emptiness of their relationship. They are not the center figures of this film, yet Antonioni includes this in a very novelistic way. He includes this relationship to connect to all the other kind of major relationships in the film, like Anna and Sandro, and then later what will be Claudia and Sandro's relationship. The minor characters are mirroring those relationships as well. So now I want to talk a little bit about the music in the film. So you may have noticed that a lot of this scene has really been just diegetic sound. There has not been any real non-diegetic sound, and certainly not a lot of swelling orchestral music or string instrumentation like you would normally get in a classical Hollywood film, where the music would be telegraphing or telling the audience how they're supposed to feel about the scene. Antonioni despised this kind of device in film, and he really wanted the music to sit in the background and not tell the audience how to feel. He did not want to heighten the suspense with music or cue emotion or guide our interpretation of the scene. So this music by Giovanni Fusco, this score, is really kind of like a slow burn jazz score that's meant to sit in the background and not tell the audience how to feel about the scene. So in a film called The Adventure, there isn't much in the way of adventure happening so far. This film feels like it could be called a mystery film, but it doesn't follow the conventions of that genre. Instead, what we get is Anna disappears, which sets up what the audience would assume is going to be a mystery about what happened to her, but we're quickly going to find out that Antonioni is not interested in exploring the conventions of that genre, and instead is going to give us a film about something that really has nothing to do with Anna. So we've jumped ahead again, and the rest of the party has now returned to the yacht, but Claudia, Sandro, and Corrado have decided to stay behind in a stone hut that they've found that is used by a fisherman who says he's from Australia when he comes to the island. And this scene is really interesting because, as we see here, Claudia is waking up, and the pacing here is extremely slow, and the take here is extremely lengthy. And that's very unusual for 1960, because we're really watching in real time without a lot of cuts, and we're watching some stuff that doesn't really advance the plot at all. And this take is so lengthy that the crowd at Cannes actually booed this scene when it premiered, because nothing was happening. As I said, there we just got a cut, but instead we get this extended sequence as Claudia walks over to the window, she opens it up, she looks outside. There's nothing here to advance the plot, but that's really the point. We're getting a cinema of interiority here. Antonioni wants us to observe Claudia's gestures, to get a feel for her state of mind, to try to contemplate what she might be thinking about in this moment. These kinds of moments are omitted by fades and dissolves in a typical classical Hollywood film with its traditional film grammar, but that's kind of the point. Antonioni is sort of forcing us to exist in this moment with Claudia. And look at this as she takes this shirt out of her bag, and this was Anna's shirt that Anna had actually put in her bag, and she's going to wear it. And you see how we cut there to the turbulent sea as she takes that shirt out, which I think again is supposed to mirror her interiority, her feelings, her emotions. As she takes Anna's shirt out and puts it on, she's feeling that turbulence of of the sea that we just saw. Now we're going to slowly pan up to reveal Sandro outside here, standing on a cliff, and this sort of romantic vignette, and almost the scene here almost reminds me of sort of classical novelistic fiction, a lone hero sort of sitting on a windswept hill, the clouds and the sea behind him, feeling a bit restless. And here he gets up and turns to meet Claudia, who's coming out to talk to him. And what we're going to get here is an interesting moment between the two of them, where now we just cut and broke the 180-degree rule. We've now inverted the relationship spatially between Sandro and Claudia, so that now Sandro is on the left, and he was alone in the frame there, which I thought was really interesting. Normally you would get a two-shot there, but instead he's not even able to occupy the same frame as Claudia, which comes back to the idea of the isolation that Antonioni is really trying to capture. But notice in this sequence the volcano that's in the background between the two of them. Remember, we saw a volcano before in a frame with Claudia. Now we get it when Sandro and Claudia are sharing the frame. What does it suggest? Well, I don't think it's a symbol so much as a metonym again, like the classical architecture in the background in the opening of the film. It's in the background, barely noticeable, but we get a sense that, like a volcano, which is potentially explosive, there are emotions between these characters that are unsaid, also just under the surface, which have the potential to erupt at some point. So now this is later in the day, and the rest of the party, Patricia and Giulia and Raimondo, have returned from the yacht, and the authorities are going to bring Anna's father to the island here in a moment. But here's kind of interesting scene where Patricia is questioning how Sandro is reacting to Anna's disappearance, and sort of perplexed why he would be so tranquil. And we notice that Claudia defends him by saying he was up all night. And now we get this scene, which I find to be really interesting because it feels a lot like a digression that doesn't advance the plot at all, but I do think it has some thematic significance. So this diver has found a vase while looking for Anna's body, and we're going to see as the party passes it around. So Corrado passes it here to Giulia. Giulia admires it, and now she hands it to Raimondo. Now watch what happens as Raimondo holds it here. Claudia's going to walk off, and he drops it as he kind of turns and looks and watches her walk away. Says, "What a shame," and it figures, and he just sort of shrugs it off here. So we see it smashed to pieces. So why include this? Again, I think this is a good example of Antonioni telling the story through these small moments and these metonyms. This vase, to me, is a metonym for antique art. Art that was made to capture something beautiful and transcendent and last the ages. And it has lasted all this time in the turbulent waters without being destroyed. But look what happens when careless hands touch it. I think it connects to the larger theme that modernity no longer cares about beauty or transcendence. Think about how these characters are so narcissistic and self-absorbed, especially Anna and Sandro, and they try to live these hedonistic lives to escape the meaninglessness and emptiness of modern life. Now look at the two books here that were found among Honest Things. It was F. Scott Fitzgerald's Tender is the Night and the Holy Bible. And I think this is really interesting to me. So Tender is the Night is quite a tragic book by F. Scott Fitzgerald about a marriage that ends very tragically, where there's a doctor who is a psychiatrist and he nurses a patient named Nicole back to health after she goes through a sort of emotional breakdown. And yet, as she gets stronger, he gets weaker, and eventually she casts him off, and he ends up a broken shell of a man by the end of the book. And given its bleak view of marriage, it's appropriate here, since Anna did not want to marry Sandro and felt that eventually their marriage may end up very much like Nicole and the narrator in Tender is the Night. So here Sandro kisses Claudia for the first time. So remember we saw that volcano in the background with those feelings that were about to erupt, and now we're seeing those feelings come to the surface. As an audience, I think we could sense for a while that these two characters had something going on between the two of them that was unsaid, that was beneath the surface, and now Sandro makes that move and brings those feelings out. So the film is not really concerned here with answering the question of why Sandro has these feelings, or why he quickly goes from, being with Anna to now exploring the possibility of being with Claudia. That's really not the point. The film seems more concerned with answering or exploring, not answering anything really, but exploring this idea of characters after an event has happened, an event which has no clear cause. So, unlike the classical Hollywood structure where we would have cause and effect logic governing the plot, in this case, Anna has disappeared, which is the effect, but we have no cause for disappearance. Instead, we explore the consequences of that disappearance on the characters. And here we're seeing that one consequence is that these characters are drawn to each other, they have feelings for each other, and they're actually exploring them even at a time where to do so would feel perhaps too soon in light of the fact that Anna is missing and, in fact, may be dead. I think that fade out there is really interesting because it's actually an instance where Antonioni uses classical film grammar transitions, because we are seeing a lapse of time here. So, right after Sandro kisses Claudia, the film takes us to the next stage of the search. Sandro and Claudia have followed a possible lead in the investigation into Anna's disappearance. Here we see some authorities who are going to be bringing some local smugglers into what appears to be a police station or a municipal office for questioning, because these smugglers had been operating in the area around the island where Anna vanished. The hope is that someone might have seen her or might know something about what happened. In fact, they think that maybe the smugglers had taken Anna on board and were protecting her because she maybe paid them money or something like that. And so they're going to interrogate the smugglers here. And this really feels like it's going to fall into what audiences expect of a mystery sort of genre film, where we go through that sort of procedural, we're going to interrogate these witnesses and then interrogate these witnesses. And Antonioni is sort of playing with us here and making us feel like we're going to be slipping into that mode of storytelling, that conventional mode of storytelling. But of course, that's never what this film is going to be. It was never going to be that, because Antonioni is not interested in making that kind of film. So instead, we're getting this sequence sort of goes nowhere, ends sort of abruptly here, and we get this scene. So as Sandro is leaving, and the smugglers are being released here because they're of no use to the authorities, we're going to see this really interesting moment where Sandro is admiring the architecture, and this officer says this is the man who built the villa. He never would have imagined it would look like this or would be used for this. And then the camera pans up the wall very slowly like this to show us the ornate decorations on the wall here. I, again, think this is extremely significant because remember, Sandro is an architect himself. He's constantly being associated with architecture in the film. Sandro is someone who wants to be building things, who wants to be creating art, but instead as a consultant, and that's how he's made his wealth. And he's not finding that his current vocation is very meaningful to him. So I think that pan that we saw a second ago, where Antonioni takes the time to just slowly pan up that wall and show us the ornate architecture again, it's important. It connects back to the vase, it connects back to the building in the distance in the very beginning of the film, because we're looking at a world that is the modern world where the past past is still very much part of the present in terms of the architecture being omnipresent and being repurposed to fit the needs of the present, yet people's connection to that beauty and the time it took to create that kind of ornate design, the beautiful decorations, all of that has been lost in the present as people increasingly live, like I said before, these self centered, narcissistic lives, disconnected from anything transcendent, and really living a life that is centered on themselves, which, again, I think is really what this film is talking about, is what happens when people no longer believe in something larger than themselves, something beautiful, something transcendent, and instead focus everything on the pursuit of wealth and the pursuit of hedonistic pleasure. We end up with a sort of meaningless lifestyle where people feel disconnected from purpose, they feel disconnected from each other. So I think now would be a good time to pause and talk about the institutional context and the national institutional context surrounding L'Avventura in 1960 when Antonioni is making it. According to Gene Youngblood, who did the commentary track for the Criterion edition of L'Avventura, Italian cinema before Antonioni, which was mainly Italian neorealism since the early 40s, before that white telephone films under Mussolini's fascist government, had been known for its depiction of common people under conditions of economic and social misery, especially during post-World War II Italy. Directors like Roberto Rossellini and Vittorio De Sica favored stories rooted in social reality and moral intent, often depicting the plight of common folks attempting to live through harsh circumstances. Their stories also tended to deal with blue-collar protagonists and immediate social issues. Films from that period also tended to be realistic, dealing with material reality as opposed to the psychological or spiritual. They made heavy use of on-location shooting, naturalistic sets, and plots derived from mundane circumstances. Italian cinema became a major art form because of these films that were coming out in the early 1940s. Antonioni came from the same Italian film tradition, but instead of realism, his interests lay elsewhere. While Italian neorealists were concerned with depicting the conditions of poverty and working class strife, Antonioni was concerned with the emotional and spiritual lives of bourgeois characters. Themes of alienation, failed communication, and emotional barrenness became common in his films. These themes came to make up what Youngblood calls the cinema of regard. So what does Youngblood mean by the cinema of regard? Well, it's sometimes called interior realism. And Antonioni's not the first to explore this new type of filmmaking, this sort of post-Italian neorealism filmmaking. It was really Roberto Rossellini himself, the one who made Rome Open City and really started neorealism, who started to shift into this mode of interior realism in the 1950s in his films with Ingrid Bergman. In particular, he made, I believe it was 3 films with her, and in those films he starts to make that shift away from neorealism. And that's probably because the economy had been getting better in Italy in the 1950s, so Italian neorealism and this idea of people struggling with material reality wasn't as necessary, and audiences weren't as fascinated with this, so they started to become more fascinated with the psychic aftermath of the war, what it had done psychically to individuals. So while Italian neorealism showed people getting by and reconstructing the world after the war, these films that were coming after it explored how that struggle affected people psychologically and morally. They wanted cinema to be less about spectacle and more invested in the behavior of the characters, their interior selves, their psychology. And this is where Antonioni really enters the picture. At one point, he actually describes Bicycle Thieves by Vittorio De Sica as the problem of the bicycle, which is a story about uh, a man struggling. He needs to get a job. The only way to get a job is he needs a bicycle. He gets the bicycle, and then on his first day of work, it's stolen. And the rest of the film is really about him searching for that bicycle. And Antonioni asks us what is going on within that character. So in that film, we don't get the interiority of the main character. Instead, we get what the external circumstances do to him and his desperation in trying to find it. But what Antonioni is asking is what good is what's happening around us if we don't feel anything? Cinema in this period that Antonioni is really inaugurating became more fascinated with characters' emotions, anxiety, psychological motivations, and anything that really forced characters to fall out of step with modern society.
Cercavo un'energia e mi sono accorta che
So at this point, Claudia has essentially begged Sandro to let her alone, to leave the train, and so he does, and they part ways, and he ends up in Palermo, where we see this 19-year-old woman who, for some reason, apparently because her dress is torn, she's caused this huge stir. This huge crowd is gathered around, and she's being interviewed, and she's getting all this attention. And they say it's no wonder she's getting attention wherever she goes because of the way she's dressed. And these men have just flocked all around her, but we're not really sure. We're a little disoriented here because we're just thrust into this scene with no context, no explanation. There's no attempt to weave it into the continuity of the rest of the story. And I think it's just here, and it's actually not very realistic, by the way, because you wouldn't see all these men just flocking around this woman, this one woman who has this rip in her dress. I don't think, we're meant to believe that this is realistic. It's very exaggerated. And I think it's here again to highlight the hedonism of this modern era, that people are just worshiping sexuality in a way that is really not healthy. I mean, look at all this whole crowd just gathered here to see this woman because she has a rip in her dress. It really seems exaggerated and unhealthy, and it points to a fixation on human beings, a fixation again on something that is not transcendent, but something that is temporary and hedonistic. So I need to explain that Claudia left Sandro behind. She asked him to leave, and he went on to Palermo with the scene that we just saw. But she continued with the party, and actually the party continued as if Anna had never disappeared. They're going about their bourgeois lives, living as if, nothing's happened here. Their original plan was to end the cruise and continue on to Monreal, where they would meet at the princess's villa, which is where they are at now. And of course, there was a change of plans because Sandro was supposed to be with them, but he is looking for Anna right now, which, he should be doing since she's his fiancée. But Claudia has decided to, at least for the time being, continue with the original plans because she's trying to avoid Sandro. And we get this interesting scene with Giulia. Now, remember, Giulia is married to Corrado. And remember that their marriage is not very good because in those scenes on the island, there's a lot of physical space between them, representing the emotional space between them. And here she is flirting with this 17-year-old painter. And we're going to get a glimpse again of the hedonistic lives of these people who are just looking for a distraction from their inability to connect with anything meaningful. And so she is here with him, and you see all of these nude paintings in the background. And she's really here flirting with him because she wants to have some kind of experience that, first of all, maybe will make Corrado jealous if he finds out. But second of all, where she actually feels something, because we can see that these characters really aren't feeling much in this modern world. So Claudia is going to be again the witness. Remember, we talked about her being not part of this class, but invited into and becoming a witness to the behavior of the bourgeois class. And you can see here that she is kind of judging, I think, the behavior of Julia here. And we're meant to see this scene really from Claudia's perspective, as she's not morally comfortable with this flirtation. And then, of course, here they're actually kissing very passionately. And remember, she's a married woman. She's married to Corrado. And this man is actually just a boy. He's only 17. And we see this, really kind of gross behavior between the two of them. And at first, she sort of laughs at it. And then you can see she's starting to change. And she says Julia and sort of scolds her for her behavior here. And Julia does not like being scolded, of course, and basically shows her the door. And I think this is interesting because she opens the door. Claudia is going to go out the door, and you're going to see it shuts behind her, which I think is symbolic in a way of Claudia, who has been witnessing the behavior of these people who lead these very frivolous lives, who is going to be closing the door on that kind of lifestyle. At least for now, she is not interested in this kind of behavior. She doesn't like this behavior, and the door shutting on it, and watch right here from this cut there, we see that she's on the other side of the door of it now. And I think that's really important because she is sort of our, at least for now, our moral center, and maybe the one character in this film who is not a victim yet of the malaise of modern life, who there's still hope for her. She's still, I think, searching for meaning. She isn't on the other side where she believes that life is meaningless. She still has a belief in the possibilities of life. So as Claudia leaves the room and the door closes behind her, Antonioni pauses on that small moment here where she stops and looks at herself in the mirror. Youngblood points out that mirrors and Antonioni often mark moments of self-awareness. Having just distanced herself from the careless hedonism of her friends like Julia, Claudia briefly confronts her own reflection, which suggests that she's starting to see herself in a new way, or she's starting to formulate a new sense of her identity separate from the behavior of these bourgeois characters. So Claudia is going to leave the villa because she has learned that Sandro has placed a notice in the newspaper claiming that Anna may have been seen at a small pharmacy in a town called Troina. And what we're going to see, though, is that the report is not entirely genuine because Sandro kind of planted the story there to lure Claudia away from the rest of the party because he really wants to meet with her again, because he has now shifted his attentions from Anna to Claudia. So Claudia decides to follow the lead and travel to the town where she's going to meet up with Sandro here in a little bit. And we're going to see here a scene, I'm not really going to show it to you, but I want to explain it to you really quickly, where we have Sandro questioning the pharmacist, and who's the one who supposedly saw Anna, or this woman that looked like Anna, and his jealous wife, who is more concerned with whether her husband has been looking at other women than with helping the investigation. And in the end, the lead is going to go nowhere, like many of the supposed clues in the film, and it produces no real answers about Anna's disappearance, and the search simply continues. But I think the scene is interesting because the jealous wife is claiming that her husband was thinking about this woman and couldn't stop thinking about her, and they have a really kind of ugly relationship, and it just gives us another glimpse of another unhappily married couple or the idea like that in marriage, like we saw throughout the film, that you're still alone. Even when you're married to someone, you still must go through life alone because clearly there's no connection between the pharmacist and his wife, or really any of the married couples in this film. So now we see that Claudia and Sandro have left the pharmacist and his wife, and they've followed this lead to this hotel where they think maybe Anna is staying. But what we're going to find here is far from a clue, and in fact, I think it says a lot about Antonioni's structure and his film language. So Sandra and Claudia enter this frame that starts on this empty building, and it slowly pans to the right before we finally see their car enter into the frame. And when it finally appears from screen right, it pulls into this parking lot, and there's a church off to the right side of the frame, which I think is going to be really important. So they get out of the car and they just kind of stand, or Sandra stands leaning against the car, and Claudia gets out of the car and walks around, and this lasts for a little while. And to me, this is a really interesting example of Antonioni's style because the camera feels unmotivated. It's not showing us anything that feels like we need to be looking at it. It's not advancing the plot. It's causing us to sit with this unease of them still searching, but we also kind of feel like their search is hopeless. And we also feel the tension of Sandro really wanting Claudia. But what's interesting is the camera doesn't stay with them. It is way off here in the distance. So it's, we're not getting a close up. So again, the distance between us and them is almost like mirroring the distance between them, where they're not actually connecting with each other. They feel this far away from each other as we feel from them. And watch this really interesting ghost push where this camera comes from a sort of disembodied perspective and slowly pushes in toward them. And again, there's that ominous sort of cross in the background, symbolizing Christianity. I just froze the frame here because I think this really is a great shot to help us understand how to read Antonioni, because you get this church looming in the background, which was looming over them while they were in the frame, but they've left the frame and it's now very empty. And we just had this sort of ominous ghost push from a disembodied camera that was almost like watching them, but no one's watching them. It's this disembodied camera. And to me, it's a kind of profane example of modernization, how the church, once beautiful and ornate, and once very much part of these people's lives or part of civilization, is now this very nondescript building in the background of this empty lot where nobody is present. It's the emptiness of modern life, and how Christianity is not part of people's lives anymore. Now it's just kind of in the background and nondescript. And I think that is a huge part of Antonioni, this idea that religion, that faith, once very much part of people's lives pre the world wars, is now, I think, being called into question, or people aren't living lives devoted to the church because how can you when you've seen so much devastation and lives have been torn apart and there's been so much death and so much questioning of where was God through all of this. And I think that this is a big part of the art film, especially of the 1960s, this idea that Christianity is no longer a part of people's lives. So, what happens when that's no longer tethering people? When people are adrift looking for meaning, and where do they find meaning? They find it in themselves, in their wealth, in their pursuit of hedonistic pleasure, but they don't find it in anything transcendent like religion. And this, to me, is really how you read an Antonioni film. You've got to look for these things in the background, like the church and the mise en scène, and see how empty it is. And you have to really feel what Antonio is saying here. I'm freezing it again on this shot because I think this is really important. So the shot of the church is immediately replaced in a cut, perhaps one of the most striking cuts in the film, to this medium close shot of Claudia embracing Sandro's head, pulling it to her chest, smiling in what appears to be pure bliss or joy. For the first time in quite a while in the film, we see her embracing joy again, and it's striking to me because of how desolate the previous scene was, how empty it was, juxtaposed, I guess you could say, with this cut here, which is striking because of the contrast. Human bliss in contrast with the emptiness of religion in the previous shot, spatially just desolate, void, uninhabited. And then this pure bliss in the next shot suggests to me that perhaps this hedonism, this quest for pleasure, to combat the emptiness of a world void of transcendence, that the nearness of these shots together seems to be trying to brush away or desperately grab onto some fleeting pleasure to escape the dread and spiritual emptiness that previous setting imbued on her spirit. So at this point, we get a huge contrast to what we've been seeing with these wide open spaces and the characters filmed from these huge long shots to this extreme close-up of the two characters embraced in this kiss. And it really does feel like the camera is sharing the diegetic space with the characters. It is so close up in their faces that we feel like it's occupying the space with them. And we're getting some shots here that you would not actually see in a classical Hollywood film, where we don't have clear shots of each character's face. Oftentimes, characters are blocking each other's faces. Claudia's face will block Sandro's and vice versa, and you just wouldn't see this in a classical Hollywood film. And this shot right here, too, the fact that we don't see Sandro in the same shot with Claudia, the camera actually pans up and he leaves the frame before he returns to it. This is pure Antonioni here, and this is very much a drift from what you would expect to find in a classical Hollywood film. At this point, we get this train coming in from the distance, which is sort of a cliche, really, when you think of classical Hollywood. You think of Hitchcock, like North by Northwest. The train comes in as the two characters are about to have sex, and that's what's happening here. But I can't help noting that the film here sort of breaks the 180-degree rule, because we sort of expect if the train is heading from screen right to screen left in one shot, that in the next shot it would continue going in that direction. But instead, we see it moving the opposite direction here, which really could be a metaphor for this entire film. Every grammatical choice that we seem to expect Antonioni to make is defied. He goes the other direction against our expectation.